Welcome back, JP. Good to have you on this part of the series where it's really my favorite of all time because influencers sometimes come literally in a moment, right time, right place. Sometimes they come for a lifetime. I think my first influencer was my grandfather. My grandparents on that side came from Kyiv. My aunt came from Kyiv. So he had an accent. We lived in Montreal, and he used to take me for walks in the park when I was 5 or 6 years old. And one day I just asked him, was it Zeta? And that's what I called him. I said, Zeta, how do you know all these people you talk to? And he looked at me, and I remember his eyes looking at me like, what do you mean? And he said, well, one day I smiled at this person, and then he smiled back at me, and then he started talking to me. So I talked to him. And then while talking, another person walked by and smiled at us. So he came and talked to us also. And it just went on. And so when I talk about simplicity, I understood it as a 5-year-old, but I understood it even more later on, that not everything has to be complicated. The physiological to intangible to whatever happens when you smile at a person opens things up. And so that was one of many influences I've had. Can you share 2 or 3 people that have been influential in your life?
Thank you, Mark. And again, a pleasure to be here. And what a beautiful story. A smile begets a smile, which begets a world. We were talking earlier, and I was saying I'm growing up in sort of this post-colonial India, and I'm being told stories about the world as I find it, and the way that I wanted, the story that I would want to make for myself. And so, obviously, we all remember our storytellers like you do, and our first storytellers are always our families, and the stories that I and my family. From my mother's side, moved from what would now be Pakistan when India was divided and partitioned. And my father also was born on what would be the Pakistani side, but his family had already moved to what is now India. But they are very resilient, and they're people of hope, of how to do good things in the world in many ways. And my biggest takeaway from the family, and I often say it would have been so easy for my parents to have hated the set of people they left behind. Not once did I ever hear them say that. If there's something that moves me to my most deeply thoughtful moments, it's that question I forgot to ask: how come you didn't? Now they passed away. It would have been so easy for them to have said, these are the people who threw us out. And yet I'd never, ever heard my mother or my father ever say a word against that. And I don't think it was just them. It was a generation, it was a set of circumstances. And I think as we move towards a world in which we want to have less conflict, we need to understand stories like that. People who came out of deep conflict, but they forgave, they moved on. It could be in a relationship. I'll tell you another influencer. My uncle, who's a psychologist, just died 2 weeks ago. His ex-wife, who he divorced in the 1960s, sent a video. And in that video, she said, we met up 50 years later and we forgave each other. So there's something to be said for people who come out of conflict and don't hate the people who produce that conflict, and something to be said for people who forgive each other, and also perhaps for people who stand on the margins and they fight because they will not be further marginalized. And that's the third set of influencers for me. Poets I grew up with. Sarojini Naidu in India was a post-colonial poet and wrote these beautiful poems for the that Indian nationalists read out loud. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was the first, she was Jawaharlal Nehru's sister, was the first woman to lead the UN General Assembly and was India's ambassador to the United States. These are people you wouldn't think of as sort of heroes because the global north maybe has never heard of them, but we did. We grew up with the Naidus. Or Mother Teresa, even this woman who went out and she would say, my first thing, for all the flack that she got, she would say, my first duty was to feed the children and to hug them. Now, whether I agree or I don't agree with Mother Teresa, what she was saying was love came before anything else. And these are people I can admire. I don't think I could ever be them, but I admire people who come out of conflict and can still love.
Yeah, you don't have to be them, but you be the best you can be, and you can learn from them,
Yeah,
and that's fine. With this global partnership that we're involved in, Rwanda is one of the biggest examples of success there. If you want to talk about forgiveness, and the
yeah,
survivors are living with the perpetrators, and because what's the alternative?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
But you got to try. It's not that easy.
Yeah, yeah. You know, Nelson Mandela, when with the Truth and
Right?
Reconciliation Commission, it was the same thing. He said, we cannot just hate everything, all the people who were part of apartheid. You have to have just reconciliation. You need to move. And at that time, uh, it didn't convince everyone, but you have to admire the people who at that moment stepped back and said, reconciliation will take something, a totally different strategy than trying to punish people.
Yeah, I guess I don't know if you can summarize it in one sentence, but it really means that today and in the other days, silence is not the answer. You got to take a stand, but not a stand against somebody, but a stand for something. Basically, I think,
Mm.
and if everybody, because silence just lets the bully win, if you will.
Yeah.
Instead of showing the bully that not that you'll stand up to that
Hmm.
bully, but not in hate, but maybe
Hmm.
in love, like a different way of doing it. And
Yeah, or to go back to your negotiation example, understanding the bully. Some of the biggest bullies in the world, you start to hear their stories and say, my God, if they'd had a bit of love, in their
100%,
childhood or whatever, right? And not that giving them love at the age of 50 will change it around, but at least it'll show us that punishing them even more will make worst human beings out of them.
yeah, and you may not see it make a dent, but I believe it when that person goes home, they actually know it was there,
Yeah, yeah.
and it does make an impact. It may not be noticeable right away, but we're still all humans for that part. So, hey, thanks for sharing that. That was brilliant.
Thank you, Mark.